Okay, everyone, hello, and welcome to our fourth session in our virtual conference week. We're so sorry that we're not all together in Puerto Rico, but we're doing the next best thing. At least we can hear everybody's voices and see some faces. And we've had 3 great sessions so far, and I'm sure this will be another one. My name is Judy Browse, and I'm the Executive Director of the North American Association for Environmental Education. And we're so excited that you can join us today because we have a wonderful panel talking about climate change, education, and hope. And this webinar is focused on how we as educators can help address climate change and help our audiences better understand the impact of climate change on people and the planet, but also what individuals, organizations, and communities can do to help mitigate the impacts and create more resilient and healthier communities. As you know, NAAEE is a nonpartisan group, and we work with decision makers, educators, business leaders, religious leaders, and others from all walks of life who are looking for solutions to energy and climate issues. And we're working hard to not only talk about the severity of the issues, but give people hope and ideas for how we can move forward as a global society. And we have such a terrific panel today to dig into all of this. So what we have planned today is that a very quick intro to how to use Zoom. And so there you go, Sai. And then I will introduce Vicki, who is our moderator, and Vicki will be introducing the panelists. Then we'll have the panel discussion and some questions and answers with the panel, leading to questions and answers to that all of you have sent through the chat box, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then a few closing thoughts on some additional resources. So I hope that sounds okay. And now I would love to tell you how to use Zoom. If you've never used this before, there is a box that says, there's an icon that talks about the chat. If you see it on your bottom scrolling, there's also, some of you might see 3 dots, and you need to hit on that to find the chat box. That's where we want you to send your questions, because everybody is muted because we have so many people on the line that it would be too much background information. So feel free to fool around with the chat box, and if you have any problems with technology along the way, please contact Sai or Kristen. They are kind of the masterminds of the technology at the controls here, that if anybody has problems, they'll help you sort it out. Okay, so that's really, if you can't get on or you have a question about the chat box, because we really want you to listen to the panel, but also think about, as some people are talking, what questions are coming to mind for you? Okay, so now the best part is we get to dig into the panel, and I get a chance to introduce our moderator. So I truly am excited to introduce Vicki Arroyo. Vicki is a wonderful friend and colleague. She has spent her entire life working to address environmental issues and climate change. She's currently the executive director of the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown Law, where she also serves as the Assistant Dean of Centers and Institutes and a professor from practice. She oversees the center's work at the nexus of climate and energy policy, supervising staff and student work on climate mitigation and adaptation at the state and federal level. She teaches experiential environmental law courses to both law and public policy students, and she previously served at the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, where she directed the Pew's Center's policy analysis, science, adaptation, economics, and domestic policy programs, a big agenda. She also oversaw the publication of numerous reports and books and policy briefs. In addition to teaching at Georgetown Law, she has taught courses on environmental policy and climate change at Catholic University, George Mason University's Graduate Public Policy Program, and Tulane Law School. She's also practiced environmental law with a number of private firms, served in 2 offices at US EPA, including the Office of Air and Radiation and the Office of Research and Development, where she reviewed the development of standards under the Clean Air Act. She also directed Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality's Policy Office and served as Governor Buddy Roemer's environmental advisor. She's also served on several federal panels and boards, including the Executive Committee of the National Transportation Research Board of the National Academy of Sciences and the editorial boards of the Climate Policy Journal and the Georgetown Environmental Law Review. Pretty amazing. She holds a BS in biology, high honors from Emory, a double major in philosophy. She has a master's in public administration from Harvard, where she received top honors again. And she has a JD magna cum laude from Georgetown Law, where she was the editor-in-chief of the Georgetown International Environmental Law Review. And if that wasn't enough, she did a TED Talk on climate change with more than 1 million views. So we are so lucky to have Vicki with us today, to have someone with a policy background and have worked her entire life on climate to help facilitate this panel as we think about climate change and hope and education. So let's give Vicki a warm virtual welcome. Welcome, Vicki. Okay, Vicki, you're still on mute, so unmute yourself.
But
there you go.
Unmute it. Okay. Now can you hear me? You can hear me?
Yes.
No, I can't hear you because Judy's unmuted, but okay. Sorry, this is the Keystone Cup. I am going to try to exert control here over the slide, so we'll see if I can do it. If not, I'm going to ask folks to forward it for me, because we should be looking now at the other folks on the call, and it seems to think that I have remote control, but it's not allowing me to advance it. There we go.
There you go.
Oops, I want to go back a screen. There we go. So these are our terrific panelists who I'm going to introduce, and you can see them on your screens, hopefully. Dr. William Spitzer of New England Aquarium, who is the Vice President for Programs, Exhibits, and Planning in Boston, Massachusetts. He's responsible for the development of mission-driven exhibits and programs, including oversight of exhibit design and animal husbandry, as well as volunteer and education programs. He has served as principal investigator for a number of informal science education projects funded by NSF. Prior to joining the New England Aquarium in 1996, Billy gained 7 years of experience at Turk, an educational research and development firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There he directed research and development in science education. And for several years, he directed LabNet, an electronic community that served over 1,500 science teachers with forums for professional discussion, resource sharing, and collaboration. He holds a PhD in oceanography from MIT and Woods Hole, and a BA in chemistry and physics from Harvard. Next, we'll be hearing from Bernard Williams. Bernard served as a founding member of the Alliance for Climate Education, or ACE, the New York City region in 2009, before establishing its Las Vegas region in 2011. As former Director of Equity and Inclusion for ACE, he spearheaded initiatives to improve the understanding of how social issues intersect with climate change, so that its program best assists youth in infusing their values into the climate movement. His days as a 4-H youth himself in Brooklyn helped to foster this passion. While competing against some of the best basketball players in New York, he planted trees, grew community gardens, and engaged in beautification projects along with other 4-H youth. And the lessons that he learned along the way helped to spearhead his commitment to these issues, where he also earned a JD from Howard University School of Law and has served as a staff attorney at a U.S. Court of Appeals. So welcome, Bernard. And then finally, last but not least, and I don't think we'll be seeing her other than her picture here, is Jennifer Hubbard Sanchez. Jenny serves as a state specialist for sustainable programs and the manager of the Environmental Education and Research Center, a 307-acre forest for Kentucky State University in Frankfurt. She holds an MS degree in environmental studies and MA degree in Mexican anthropological studies, from Mexico actually, and a BA in Spanish. And her work at KSU focuses on creating and implementing sustainability and environmental education opportunities for diverse and multilingual audiences, so that all people can have access to culturally relevant ways to live greener, healthier lives, while appreciating and learning more about the physical environment that sustains us. Jenny serves as chair of the Kentucky Association for Environmental Education and is a member of the leadership team of the Southeastern Environmental Education Alliance. She's also proud to be a member of the 2014 EE Capacity Community Climate Change Fellowship family. So welcome to our terrific speakers, Billy, Bernard, and Jenny, and I will be handing it over to them shortly. I'd like to first give you a little bit of framing from the perspective of someone here in Washington, D.C. Judy and her team had guided us to try to give folks, even in these difficult times, especially as we're seeing with our friends in Puerto Rico, when it relates to climate and severe weather impacts, to give you a sense of hope. And I think nobody's exhibited resilience better than Judy and her team and being able to bring us together on top of all the challenges that they face. So thank you all for making this move forward despite the fact that we can't be together. Our center works primarily with U.S. states, territories, and cities on building a more resilient and sustainable future. So we work on both climate mitigation, as it's called, reducing emissions that cause climate change, and also adaptation. And we do this through a variety of mechanisms. We work on policy here in Washington, but also at the state level. So that's Ben Grumble at the microphone there in the policy development box, who's the Secretary of Maryland's Department of Environment. We work as a resource to states and communities. You see there a colleague from Georgetown, Peter Byrne in the background, and George Hawkins, who's here with DC Water. We convene climate initiatives on things like electric vehicles and other power sector initiatives, and that's represented from Tesla, speaking at the convening. And at the same time, we're really building capacity for future generations of law students, but also other undergraduates and policy students here at Georgetown and beyond. And that's going to be really important in a new field like climate change. So one of our colleagues, Jessica Granis, who works with students, actually had the opportunity more recently to inform a different important audience, and that is Congress, before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. This is her testifying on how to use our federal dollars more wisely by rebuilding differently after disasters, and we've certainly seen our share of them in recent years. You see some reports that are available on our website that might serve as resources to you in your important work. So I want to make you aware of some tools like these reports and some online databases that might be useful. These deal specifically with disaster response. So Rebuilding with Resilience was lessons learned from the Rebuild by Design competition jurisdictions in New Jersey and New York City after Sandy. And the report below was one that we did as part of informing President Obama's state, local, and tribal leaders task force on resilience. And it had over 100 recommendations that you might find interesting as it relates to trying to build more resilient communities. We engage internationally as well, and here you see us with students below and with some of the leaders of the world on this slide, and also from America in the form of, at the time, Governor Jay Inslee and Governor Peter Shumlin of Washington State and Vermont, and other leaders on the U.S. center stage, as you see a couple of years ago in Paris, which many of us who've worked on climate for many years felt was the high water mark in terms of almost 200 countries in the world, really the whole world coming together and saying that we were going to try to keep warming well below 2 degrees Celsius in keeping with what the science is telling us. And obviously, we're in a different environment now. And one of the things that our center does is to work with the leading states. And this shows letters that went in from both Republican-led states and Democratic governors to the administration before the announcement was made that the U.S. would be potentially pulling out of the Paris Agreement. These were governors urging them to stay in the Paris Agreement based on their own state leadership on both reducing emissions, but also feeling the impacts of climate change, as we're already seeing. In spite of that letter back in May, on June 1st, as many of you know, I'm sure, if not everyone, President Trump announced his plans to withdraw from the Paris Accord. It's not that easy. It takes time. It takes years, actually, but that's the intention. And immediately we saw a very dramatic response. 17 governors, including Republicans like Kasich here, but also Governors Wolf, Dayton, and others, and you can see their quotes on our website along with others expressing disagreement with this decision and moving forward with their own commitments to basically meet the Paris kinds of targets within their own jurisdictions. So alliances like We Are Still In, which is across sectors, it's states, it's cities, it's businesses, and it's universities, thousands of them saying that they want to continue on this path for a cleaner future. The U.S. Climate Alliance, which is 15 states, so at the governor's level, and you see some governors, I took this picture a couple of weeks ago during Climate Week, and this was a press briefing that Governor Cuomo hosted in his offices, but you see him, Governor Jerry Brown, Governor Inslee there with former Secretary of State Kerry, talking about the importance of subnational leadership, especially when the federal government is stepping back. And more recently, an initiative by Governor Brown and Michael Bloomberg to start really helping quantify what these commitments mean. So even in the absence of federal leadership, as we've seen in the past, U.S. states provide a great deal of leadership. And we have a tool, a state energy analysis tool that people might want to look at that captures what states have been doing. Since frankly, President Bush backed away from the Kyoto Protocol, states have been really filling in that gap in federal leadership through car standards, through renewable portfolio standards that are popular in both red states and blue states, through cap and trade programs like California's and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. And that work has really gone forward and been really important, even in the context of the last administration, which is also working on things like the Clean Power Plan, which we also supported with the states. Don't want to leave out cities because hundreds of mayors have stepped up. They've come to the climate conferences. They're releasing their own reports and showing commitment to the Paris Agreement. Having said that, we're seeing the impacts of climate change already, not just in the United States, but all around the world. But we are seeing, of course, the terrible storms in the Caribbean and Gulf Coast and my home state of Louisiana, Texas being affected by Harvey this year, of course, Maria in Puerto Rico, the firestorms in California that have caused so many deaths and so many people to flee their homes, people dying from heat waves in our own country, and the impacts abroad are even more significant. I have some personal experience with what it's like to live through that kind of displacement and extreme weather because my own family, my mom, that's her home at the top, lost her home in Katrina, and my sister and her husband, Terry, lost theirs below from the breaches of the levees that followed that very intense storm. And of course, on a global level, we're seeing this more and more. This is a Munich Re slide. They're a reinsurance company that is showing an increase in loss events worldwide. And this slide distinguishes meteorological events and hydrological events from geophysical events that are not related to climate change, like earthquakes. And you see that sort of red bar that fluctuates, but it's a little bit more stable at the bottom, but the increase in these events overall that are happening and are, frankly, have been predicted for a long time, even before we started seeing these impacts, and now we're actually experiencing them. So some tools to help you in your work and the jurisdictions that we work with, I want to make you aware of. One is a very comprehensive adaptation clearinghouse that we have on our website where you can sign on and you can use it for free. You can search for your own region of the country or city to see if they have plans and what to do with some of the changes that your area expects in an era of climate change, whether it's drought or too much water. We have a green infrastructure toolkit, sea level rise toolkits, etc. We realize that the impacts of climate change don't affect people equally, and we've been working for some time now with frontline communities that tend to be most vulnerable because of some of the disproportionate impacts of other environmental problems, because of racial and economic and educational inequalities. And here you see us working with some of our colleagues from the Gulf Coast, from Baltimore, and other jurisdictions from around the country at a convening that we had with the U.S. Sustainability Directors Network. There's a report that is available on our website that we show here on opportunities for more equitable adaptation. And we have been also featuring other folks' reports like these from these communities with partners from the environmental justice and climate justice world on an equity-focused portal to our clearinghouse. For some reason, there's a bit of a delay now in switching to the next slide, but I'm trying to move on to show you what that portal looks like. So I will try once again to click it. And if not, there we go. I just went too far now. So there is an equity focused portal. I'll show you that before I move on. Judy et al., do you guys want to take control? Because mine's not working now, sorry.
Yeah, let's see if we can take control.
Okay, need to move the other way.
Okay, we are trying to take control. So everybody be thinking about your questions for Vicki.
Okay, well, anyway, that's the last slide. Is it possible to back up a couple? If not, we'll just move on to Billy.
Sai, can you go back? There you go.
Yeah. Can you go back one more? Can you get back one more? Can you go back one more? Okay, there you go. Okay, that's where I was. So I just want to make you aware that with partners like We Act for Environmental Justice, the NAACP, the Gulf Coast colleagues that Keyshawn Battle represents, Emerald Cities Coalition, and others, we have helped to populate a adaptation equity portal that talks about both process improvements to engage communities where they live and work, and how to get people to show up at your meetings on these topics and to really engage from the ground up and to inform reports and analyses and databases and tools like the ones that I've shown you. So please take a look at that. And then can we go on to the next slide? As we've seen from Maria and the power loss that continues in Puerto Rico, when you lose power, you lose a lot of other things that really sustain life. We've seen people obviously having a hard time in hospitals with temperature control, with water, and the fact that they can't treat it. So we've had some vector-borne related illnesses in the water supply that people are also drinking from sources of water near Superfund sites. So these consequences are severe, and building a more resilient and sustainable grid by having renewable power maybe closer to home, as opposed to these major power plants that we basically then have to shift the power across a whole island like Puerto Rico, is a good thing to basically get us both to be more low carbon in our power use and consumption, but also to be more resilient to climate impacts. And next slide. One of the impacts that we're seeing in my own home state of Louisiana and in Alaska, where they're moving some people that are along the coast in the Inuit areas of Alaska, is the difficulty in being able to really basically stay where you are. And we're seeing this with questions about whether or not folks in Puerto Rico will stay where they are. There was a slide in between these two about engagement in Plaquemine Parish, which is a parish in South Louisiana, where some Native American tribes are already moving inland, and they are engaging about the process for that, trying to figure out where is a safe place that also helps to keep their culture and their communities intact. We've done a significant amount of work on disaster recovery in South Louisiana post-Katrina, in Vermont post-Irene, and in this picture in the background in the New York and New Jersey area, capturing lessons in post-Sandy, and also doing reports that show how we might be able to build amenities like this Big U project in New York that would provide for recreation and an improved quality of life even when we're not facing a disaster, but also provide a place for the water to go when there is a storm surge or heavy rainfall. The next slide, if you can advance it, please, shows some work that we're doing closer to home here in Washington, D.C. I think that's going the other way. Closer to home in Washington, D.C., we're doing work with Watts Branch, which is a tributary of the Anacostia River. And this, again, is on an environmental equity focused front, in that it's a community that is affected by unemployment, poverty, high rates of older people and with adult asthma. I don't know if you guys are still trying to advance the slide, but it'd be great to see it. There's a map of, yes, the area right there. So right here, close to home, in the nation's capital, we're seeing the impacts of climate change, but we're also seeing the DC government, along with other states, really engaging in trying to get the communities involved in a conversation about what climate change risk means to them and how to prepare for impacts like flooding and storms. So the final slide, which you previewed before, makes the point from some of the projects that we've worked on around the country that it's really up to all of us to look at our own homes and our communities and what our vulnerabilities are and exposures to climate change, and to try to find ways to not only hopefully survive, but to thrive in an era where we're going to really see some dramatic changes in our lifetime and our children's lifetime. And so with that, I do want to turn it over to some true experts in environmental education, including, speaking of children, folks that work with children, that work with the next generation to teach them about the impacts that they're going to see in their lifetime and how people in their lives, government leaders, teachers, and others are working to solve these problems and working to help their communities cope. And so with that, if y'all can get the slides up for Billy, I'm going to turn it over to Billy Spitzer with the New England Aquarium.
Great. Hi, everyone. Great to have so many people participating online. Sorry we can't all be together in one place, but at least we're together virtually. I'm going to talk about talking about climate change. Next slide, please. And since I'm in an aquarium, we talk a lot about climate change in the ocean. And as you know, climate change is a big problem that affects all of us, not only humans, but take steps to manage this problem to protect both human and natural systems from harm. And part of our responsibility is to talk about this issue. So when I say talking about climate change, I'll give you a little bit of an idea of how we talk about climate change in the ocean. And one of the things we do is we explain the science so people understand how to connect the problem and the solution. We talk about the fact that as we burn fossil fuels for energy to power our cars, our homes, our industry, we release CO2 into the atmosphere, and that CO2 acts like a heat-trapping blanket, warming the planet and disrupting the climate. And about 90% of that excess heat is absorbed by the oceans, which in some ways protects us, but that warms the oceans and disrupts marine ecosystems. And the Gulf of Maine, where I live, that big red spot in the middle, is warming at about 3 times the rate of the ocean around the world, 3 times faster. And so that's impacting fisheries, whale populations, weather systems, and sea level, and humans as well as those ecosystems. Next slide, please. So in order to deal with climate change, we really need to be much more engaged as citizens, as communities, as leaders. And in order for this issue to really be part of the policy discussion, we need much more public discourse and civic engagement. Yet we know from research by the Yale Project on Climate Communication that something like 64% of Americans discuss climate change only occasionally or not at all. And that's a big problem. Next slide, please. But we have a big opportunity, and the opportunity that I see in the informal science sector is that we have something like 1,500 informal science centers throughout the US, and obviously more if you look throughout North America or the world. And those are visited in the US by something like 60 or 65% of the public. And about 70% of those visitors understand that climate change is the most important environmental issue that we face. And nearly 3/4 believe that places like zoos and aquariums and museums should actually give them recommendations for what to do. Next slide, please. So what we've been working on over the last 8 or 10 years or so is an effort to train enough people at informal science centers to use evidence-based communication techniques to really help shift the national conversation on climate change to be much more productive, much more creative, and much more solutions focused. And it's been a partnership with many organizations, science organizations, social science organizations, informal educations and so on, formal education organizations and so on. we really feel like we've been able to start to get some traction on this issue. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show now, or Sai's going to help show a really brief 2.5-minute video that kind of tells that story.
The National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, known as NAAEE, is a committed group of informal science educators who are changing the conversation on climate change. Rather than doom and gloom, they're focused on hope and civic action. Educators at aquariums, zoos, and museums facilitate millions of conversations each year, but climate conversations weren't happening because science educators were unsure of how to guide them productively in a family-oriented setting. Thanks to funding from the National Science Foundation, a partnership was formed between climate scientists, informal science educators, and social scientists to create a training program for interpreters at aquariums, zoos, nature centers, and parks. The program worked with strategic framing, an empirical approach to science translation to help interpreters in their work and in their conversations with friends, family, and colleagues. The NAAEE program launched in 2011 and has been refined as the network grew. Program evaluations have found that our alumni develop more confidence in their ability to explain climate science, increasing their willingness to discuss climate concepts. NAAEE language increased people's understanding of climate change, their support for solutions, and commitment to civic engagement, and we've shown that strategic framing can turn concerned individuals into active and engaged citizens. By July 2017, over 400 colleagues from 170 institutions in 38 states had joined our community, and our community is reporting consistent improvements in its own effectiveness. Using innovation, collaboration, and empirical inquiry, NAAEE has launched a growing network of climate interpreters with tools that help millions of Americans understand why our climate is changing and motivate them to get started on solutions in their community.
Great, thanks, Sai. And we can go on to the next slide. So we've shown, based on a lot of program evaluation work, that this network that we built helps create more confident, more knowledgeable, more active interpreters at all these informal science centers, that their friends, family, and colleagues report learning more, understanding more, and doing more about climate change, that the visitors that they interact with have a better understanding of this issue, are more hopeful, and feel more confident in their ability to talk about and act on climate change. And the conversations that are happening are more likely to be hopeful, confident, and solutions-oriented. And we've also shown that being part of this supportive network really helps individual institutions achieve greater success. Next slide, please. So over the last 10 years or so, this has represented about $10 million in investment from several federal agencies. As I've said, it's been a really big partnership with a number of different kinds of groups, including climate scientists, social scientists, and educators. Most of our work has been based on doing pretty intensive training, about 100 hours over 6 months. We've also done shorter kind of one-day workshops, and we've really worked on building this national coalition and network that is really spanning across the country. Not only in liberal coastal states, we have strong presence in places like Texas and Florida, and other areas that really represent the diversity of the country. And as I mentioned, we really have good impact data, so we're pretty confident that this program is doing what we want it to do. Next slide, please. So just to give you kind of a few key kind of hints and kind of talking points about effective climate communication, we always start with values. What is at stake for all of us? Often we talk about stewardship for the next generation, or responsibility to deal with problems, responsible management, or the importance of protecting people and other living things from harm. And then we use explanation, as I was saying, to really help link the problem and the solution, explaining enough about what is happening and how it works that people can see the connection. And really, this is often done in 60 seconds or less because as informal educators, we don't have necessarily the luxury of a lot of time. And then we quickly get to solutions, what we can do to mitigate this problem and adapt at a community level. Next slide, please. We focus on a conversational tone, the fact that we all depend on ecosystems, explanations such as using the idea of CO2 as a heat trapping blanket, which is a well-tested metaphor, and focusing on community solutions. We avoid talking about a crisis, which is something that tends to turn people off. We don't focus on pitting jobs versus the environment, because that's really kind of a false distinction. There are so many jobs associated now with the alternative energy sector. It's one of the fastest growing sectors in the economy. We don't talk about the greenhouse effect because people really don't understand how greenhouses work. As I was saying, we focus much more on community actions than individual consumer actions, which are the things that people are already thinking about. And so with our kind of one shot at getting to people, we really try to focus on the things they haven't thought about, which are much more kind of community oriented. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've started to do at our own institution is we have an exhibit called the Blue Planet Action Center, which focuses on what people can do to help the oceans. And we just installed a pretty big exhibit area that's about climate change in the oceans, and particularly how to help visitors take some of the lessons we've learned and apply them themselves. So we now have a whole wall that's kind of focused on kind of applying some of these simple steps for communication. Next slide, please. And some of the resources that we have available, and I think we'll be able to post these up on the EE Pro site. ClimateInterpreter.org is kind of a one-stop shopping site that's hosted by Monterey Bay Aquarium, one of our key partners, that's really designed for informal educators and providing resources for them. Several other websites are listed up here. Our Gnocchi website, bizchange.org, is a related project we did with NOAA that was on developing visual tools for interpreting climate-related issues. And the Clean Network is a great resource for formal educators and K to 16. Next slide. So we feel that we've really been able to have an impact over the last few years. We've built this growing network of institutions around the country. We've seen increasing demand for this kind of evidence-based communications training. It makes me feel really hopeful that we can get some traction on this issue. We've seen the impact of effective dialogue in the institutions that we work with. It really is a critical environmental behavior. I think we often overlook talk as a behavior, and talk is one of the first key steps we need to get through to really make the changes that we need to make as a society. I think, as Vicki said, we've been seeing a lot of action happening at the community level, at the municipal level, at the state level, at the regional level, and that seems to be going on and advancing despite any of the kind of sort of national gridlock or international gridlock that we've seen. So, I think this is a great time for us to really build on place-based institutions, which many of you all in the AEE world are, to really advance this issue. So I will stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Billy. That was great. That was really inspiring, and I think you gave us a lot of really good, tangible ideas that people can use in their own conversations, so thank you for that. So now we're going to switch over to Bernard and hear a little bit about his personal story as well as his work now on the ground in communities. Bernard.
Thank you so much, Vicki. I'm going to share my screen right now, and if there's a problem with it, someone let me know. All right. So Billy and Vicki really provided you all with some great tools. And what I'm going to do now is kind of talk about the spirit behind the tools. We can do all of the right things, but if we don't have the right spirit, people are not going to want to connect with us, and they're not going to want to work with us. So Billy stated that sharing values is an important component of climate education. And I'm going to peel that onion back some to show how sharing values requires a safe and inclusive environment which welcomes the wisdom of our most resilient populations, and how by doing so, we'll gain the hope and knowledge we need to fight climate change. I have been asked to speak of hope, so I must first discuss suffering. From suffering, I'll address the resiliency to show why resiliency leads to the shared values that give us hope. Right now, we're going through periods of hopelessness. We're watching the EPA wilt and the Clean Power Plan decompose into a fossil. We're watching the most responsible for climate change receive massive tax breaks, while the people least responsible suffer the most and get chastised for their suffering. So as organizers and educators, parents and climate believers, we're experiencing periods of hopelessness, self-doubt, and anger. We know what happened. It's clear to us here what looms. Climate injustice drops tears on Puerto Rico, and prayers for Irma's bewares at every room. But if we're going to talk about hope, let's first talk about where hope cannot come from. Hope cannot come from the pie in the sky. If it sounds too good, it is. My ancestors never received the 40 acres and a mule that they were promised. So we need to be truthful and transparent. So what builds hope? Learning from the resiliency of our planet's most systemically oppressed people. To be specific, African Americans, Latinx, immigrants, indigenous populations, women of color, youth of color, just to name some. Learning from them, cherishing their knowledge and values, appreciating their connections to climate change, modeling their strength and dignity. Offering, also what builds hope is offering multiple entry points to climate education, intersecting the science with impacts and systemic injustice learning, matching climate education with values. And what I'm going to do is show how my values weren't included at some point and what that did to me. So I entered the environmental movement in 2008 by joining Sierra Club. Let me give you a little context about that. It was before Green 2.0 published a report about the lack of diversity in Big Greens. It was before Big Greens openly touted the Hermes principles of organizing. It's before Black Lives Matter and before the People's Climate March. Before mainstream orgs prioritized intersectional climate issues, and it was during the early days of the Obama presidency, which for some of you feels like decades ago. Now, I joined because I was concerned about human rights and the energy crisis, the stigma that people of color don't care about the environment, the belief that Greens only cared about animals and the planet and not people. I wanted to connect with my roots, my Brooklyn, New York youth roots in 4-H, where I was involved in youth organizing and youth leadership. I wanted to connect my values to climate change, bring diverse groups and ideas together were my values, building trust and community, teamwork. I expected that there would be an adjustment period, and I had had lots of experience assimilating in the past. You see, I summered in all-white youth camps for years, beginning at age 5. And it was at that time where I was first called nigger and darky, and much worse from day one at the age of 5. But I persevered. It ended up becoming my favorite camp of the many I attended until I was the age of 14. I also took frequent trips to Cornell University through New York City 4-H. I attended a majority white university, Stony Brook. Also in my work experience, I worked for a Fortune 500 company as a salesperson. I worked at a New York City law firm as a paralegal and the United States Court of Appeals as an attorney. So in essence, adaptation should have been simple for me, but it wasn't. I felt isolated. I felt discarded. I felt threatened, like it appeared my values weren't welcome. I wondered, was I supposed to pretend I was a vegan? Was I supposed to pretend like I hike national parks by day and read about John Muir at night in my tent by candlelight? I felt discarded. I was hired by Sierra Club through a 7-month process. And they fired me after only 4 months. I felt devalued. I questioned if I belonged in the environmental movement. I wondered if my skills were needed, if they were wanted, and most of all, I felt broken. And that's when I joined the Alliance for Climate Education weeks later. It was a precipitous drop in salary and title, a move that's not foreign to resilient populations. I felt hopeful, but still very much broken, a feeling that remained for years. Now, ACE's mission is to educate young people on the science of climate change and empower them to take action. And while I was there, I worked with high school and college-age youth in many capacities, built relationships with 104 schools, trained or educated over 100,000 young people nationwide about climate change. And that experience let me understand the power of youth. You see, working with young people taught me the importance of creating safe spaces where they can express their opinions fully and challenge me and challenge each other. Creating those safe spaces so they can support each other's values, the values like mine that were discarded. Learning how to offer them a balance is what I learned, to offer them a balance of freedom and support. I found that freed them to problem solve and allowed them to achieve more than even they expected. And from them, I grew, and it allowed me to become the Director of Equity and Inclusion at ACE. Now, during that ascent, Sierra Club actually reached out to me to apologize for letting me go. The executive who had attended my firing, you know when you get fired and you have the manager who's watching the manager that's actually firing you? She was that person. She was there for support for the manager. She contacted me, and we met, and she acknowledged that letting me go was a mistake. She admitted that she and the org had made core changes since. She even agreed to share resources with me in my new director role with ACE, so we can share learning. She couldn't believe how quickly I accepted her apology. I responded that the climate movement needs both sincere apologies and forgiveness, and people and organizations must model this behavior. And a weight lifted off of me that I thought had no longer existed. So it was through that, that was my choice. My choice was to forgive, and I think that is a choice that I want to share with all of you. You see, I choose to forgive. Sierra Club has made great changes since then, and I believe it. And they're going to continue to do work, and they have a long way to go, but they're serious about it. I choose to believe that we will always strive to understand everyone's values more clearly. I choose to stand with the people of Puerto Rico and my ancestors who endured slavery, as I have so much to learn, and so must we all. I choose to believe that personal story is important, and that yours is equally important. But we need to equally listen to the stories of resilient populations and learn from them. So here are my reasons for hope. I'm hopeful because of the integrity of the resilient population. Their willingness to share their expertise, their patience in teaching us gives me hope. I'm hopeful because organizations like Sierra Club and other Big Greens are becoming more intersectional and inclusive with their approach. They're learning from resilient populations. They're growing to appreciate their values and personal stories better. I'm hopeful because of the People's Climate March and movement, because for once we allowed resilient populations to take the lead and look at how big it became. And I'm also hopeful because of youth leadership. I had a young person that I work with told me that she was going to do my job better than me, and I loved it. So let's expand climate education's reach. Here's how I suggest we can do so. Let's continue to educate ourselves on resilient populations. Let's find ways to incorporate personal narrative into our materials. That's what I did with you all today, so that you can learn my values and interests and concerns and experiences, and then you in turn can share your values and your interests and concerns and experiences. We must learn to be vulnerable and authentic during tough conversations. Resilient populations aren't going to trust you unless you're vulnerable and authentic the way they are. You must provide multiple paths for engagement. It's not just about science. It's also about art, music, justice, animals, cities, coasts, trees, ice cores. Keep improving how we inspire our audience to learn from each other, critical. And partner with other educators who have skill sets different from ours, also critical. I also ask you to train yourself to stand in solidarity with resilient populations. Learn to remain in uncomfortable, safe spaces alongside them. It will benefit you and your community. Also to forgive others and allow them to do better, and to forgive yourself and allow yourself to improve. Utilize consultants. For example, Partners for Collaborative Change, Fierce Allies, Brace Forward are some of many examples. Hire resilient people who facilitate growth and learning internally. A lot of times the best people who can help you are the people you already have on staff, and a lot of times they don't feel comfortable sharing all of their knowledge because it's not comfortable yet, it's not safe enough. Read the Hermes Principles of Organizing, then reread it many times and focus on making it the backbone of everything you do. And in closing, let me say this. Learning occurs when we are in uncomfortable yet safe spaces. Sharing my personal story just now was uncomfortable. Reading the quote on the right, if you have time to read it, is uncomfortable. Climate change is uncomfortable. So let's continue to learn how to be uncomfortable together. Finally, I'm in the process of looking for a new challenge. And if any of you know of some positions that you think I might be interested in, or if you want me to speak to your teams, or if you just want to contact me after this just to say hello and to make a connection, here's how you can reach me. Thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure. Warm hugs to everyone.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to listen to Jenny. I don't think she's at a computer where we can see her, but we look forward to seeing her slides and hearing her perspective. As you've heard, she's done work in a lot of different places, including in Mexico, as well as Kentucky, and I think also in Vermont. And so, Jenny, take it away.
Thank you very much, Vicki. I'm sorry. I want to thank NAAEE and Judy for this opportunity. This is really just an amazing honor to be able to speak to everyone. And I was invited to speak on hope and sources of hope. And I believe the perspective that was sought was really perspective of hope in kind of boots on the ground work in a place where climate education may not be encouraged, may not be as emphasized, as well as we live in a place where impacts aren't directly felt on a daily basis. So I'm here to talk a little bit about where I find hope and how I maintain that hope. Next slide, please. So just kind of to give a little bit of background and understanding, as Vicki just told you all, I was born and raised in Vermont. Ironically, we talked a little bit about sort of the kind of liberal states in the country. Billy talked about Vermont. Vicki talked about Vermont. I was born and raised in Vermont. I always called myself sort of a child of ecological privilege, being born and raised there. And then I moved to Puebla, Mexico, which is in the central part of the country. And after about 4 years there, I chose to make Kentucky my home. Those are three very different places, three very different cultures, the value systems, priorities. So for me, I think that where I am today has come from multiple perspectives and multiple experiences, not only my own, but also those folks that I have met along the way, the journeys that I have been able to share, and the people that I have been able to learn from. So 15 years later, here I am in the state of Kentucky, a Vermont girl with an international family teaching about climate change in the state of Kentucky. Next slide. So to give some background on the program focus areas that I work in specifically, I do work for Cooperative Extension at Kentucky State University, which is located in Frankfort. We are the historically Black land-grant institution of the state of Kentucky. Here I manage a 307-acre nature preserve where I like to dedicate most of my time to providing educational opportunities for all people but I especially focus on some of our newer neighbors, immigrant and refugee populations, as well as a lot of the kids from our big cities, Lexington and Louisville, who really, for the most part, when they come out to our center, this is, for many, the first time that they've ever been in a forest. And as you can see on my slide, these are a lot of the kids that we are blessed to get to work with and blessed to host at our center. The second thing that I get to do is empower school teachers, natural resource professionals, 4-H agents, a whole bunch of folks that are trying to really integrate climate change education into their curricula, and really, again, in the state of Kentucky, have not been given the tools to do that. And so quite possibly the favorite thing that I get to do, and the most challenging for sure, is being able to do climate education in this state. I can say 5 years ago in Kentucky, climate education in the state was weak at best. Talking about climate change in our state is not common, it's not popular. We're not Vermont, we're not California. And so really being able to even bring this up and educate on it has been a very challenging thing for me in my career in the last few years. I can say that we have seen tremendous growth in demand. We've got lots of new participants, lots of new educators that have shown interest in being able to integrate this into their non-formal as well as their formal classrooms and programming. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about the programs that I feel have empowered me, and in turn I've been able to use to empower others when teaching about climate change. You all can see all of the different logos there, but I do want to talk specifically about a few of them. When I really first got into learning how to be a better climate educator and a better climate change communicator, I was very fortunate to be part of NOAA's Climate Stewards Education Project. And from there, really got to start doing more work on the ground with teaching and communicating about climate change, doing some of the basic science workshops for teachers and county agents and, you know, anybody that really would listen, I guess I would say 5 years ago. Some of the tools that I have used would be the Pine Map Project Learning Tree Southeastern Forest and Climate Change module. That is one that has been very helpful in the state for classroom teachers, those who are really trying to target next generation science standards, which Kentucky is actually the first state testing on that. So this has been very helpful, especially for classroom teachers. One of the opportunities that I've received that has been both a personal and professional blessing for me would be NAAEE's EE Capacity Community Climate Change Fellowship. 3 years ago, I guess, NAAEE selected 26 educators from Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. And I got to say, this has really been kind of like inheriting 25 brothers and sisters, as well as maybe 10 other aunties and uncles who have just served as sources of hope, sounding boards, people to commiserate with. You know, we've got folks from places like California that are really doing it, and I've always been kind of, I almost want to say jealous, because they're out there and they're talking about climate and they're working in neighborhoods and people are really listening. And I'm just kind of here in Kentucky trying to not get in trouble doing my job. So for me to be able to work with such amazing people that have been able to pass on so many positive lessons about what they've been able to do, this has definitely been a source of just great hope in my educational capacity personally, as well as what I've been able to pass on to others. Lastly, the Kentucky Association for Environmental Education and the Kentucky University Partnership for Environmental Ed. Again, 5-6 years ago, I was kind of out there by myself doing some of this climate education. 2-3 years ago, we decided with KAEE and the University Partnership that we would go ahead and apply for an EPA grant. And we were very lucky. We received the grant in 2015, but we did not get the funds until just about a year ago, and we did get that funding. And so across the state currently, all of our public universities are working with classroom teachers and other non-formal educators to help them learn about climate education and to teach that. So just amazing strides as far as going from not so much a few years back to now there are so many more people that are talking about it, educating, and in fact demanding this kind of education. Next slide, please. So where can we find hope, and where do I find hope? Again, this increase in local participation, I will say in the first year that I started, I had 17 participants in a climate change training that I did. And that was it for the entire year. 17 Kentuckians that were interested in hanging out and learning about climate change. And I'm really happy to say that this year, I personally, now this is not including any of the other universities or other programs out there, I'm up to over 150 folks that have participated. I've got a workshop coming up next week. I have 26 people signed up, and I've had to turn 10 people away because we just don't have enough materials. So to see this increase in local participation and people that are really wanting these tools to teach about climate change, for me, has been a source of hope. Very slow progression, but it's been something that has been, it's just very exciting to watch. And Bernard hit this very well. Youth, working with young people, they get it. You don't need to convince them. There are no real folks out there under a certain age that are saying, nope, this isn't happening. Nope, it's not us. And so to be able to look at the next generation of leaders and those that are going to be inheriting a lot of this from us, I find great hope in being able to look ahead and know they're not going to be debating the problems. They're going to be figuring out solutions and figuring out ways that we can become more resilient to this problem. Another source of hope for me would be partnerships that have led to relationships built around education. I have been very blessed in the state of Kentucky to find colleagues in the field who are now friends and who are now family. And I would recommend to anyone, don't just go to a meeting to get information. Go to a meeting to find friends, find relationships, and find people that can share resources, share feelings, share sentiments, because truly that's what gets you through, I think, when you do find yourself without hope. I will say hope, it is all around us, regardless of your situation. We went to a conference about a month ago, and I did a climate workshop there and actually had a gentleman that works for Marathon Oil that showed up to the training. I was, needless to say, a little bit nervous. I had never had an employee of an oil company at one of my workshops, but I will say after 4 hours together, hearing the dialogue that went on with the participants and seeing all sides of an issue, it was respectful, it was rich. It was a conversation where this gentleman walked out and said, if the entire world could sit down and talk for 4 hours the way that we just talked, we would be able to partner our way out of a lot of these problems. And so for me, being able to reach across aisles and being able to see things from another perspective and know that there are folks on all sides that are willing to do that also gives me great hope. And lastly, the last source of hope I really want to point out, we all know the future is daunting. And for me, again, a Vermont girl living in Kentucky, I never really thought I would see the day when I would be able to drive down the interstate headed toward eastern Kentucky and find a solar farm. However, this picture that you see is actually right off Interstate 64. I was traveling with my husband and children. We were going camping, and I looked up, and all of a sudden, there's this solar farm on the side of the road in the state of Kentucky. So in Billy's presentation, he had one slide that said solar is just one of the many community solutions. And I would say for me, it's a great source of hope. Being able to see that solar farm, being able to see that in a coal state where coal still dominates our local conversation, the fact that I can now tap into a solar farm and an energy cooperative like this is a great source of hope. Next slide, please. So my tips for hopeful success. Number one, I think it's really important, and I think Bernard covered this very well. We are not the first to struggle, and we are not the only to struggle. And I think that a lot of people forget this. I think that it is a privilege that I have to be sitting here giving this presentation. If you were to ask a lot of our friends in communities of color, if you were to talk to people from oppressed communities, if you were to talk to our colleagues and fellow citizens in Puerto Rico today, my husband's grandmother who lives up in the Andes Mountains and is looking for sources of water, I think that hope for those folks would be very different than the hope that I'm trying to talk about today. So keep your perspective when you're talking about hope. Many of us are very, very fortunate, and so we're the ones that have the onus of really holding out hope when other people may be losing it. Know your audience and hear your audience. Again, I think Billy covered this really well. Science is really important. However, climate change is a value-laden topic. And so respecting people's backgrounds, respecting their feelings on issues is really the only way that we're ever going to be able to get the message across and lead to greater change. When you do climate education, prepare yourself with information from all sides. Know what the myths are, know how to discuss those, but don't lend credibility to those either. The more time we spend debating these myths, the more time they become real in people's minds. And so sticking to the science, sticking to the message is a really, really important tool to get through to your audience. Keep your information relevant and local. We care about what we know. Polar bears are beautiful and they're really cute, but nobody has a polar bear in their backyard. We have children, we have pets, we have parents, we have families. Talk to parents about things like tick-borne illness. Talk to farmers about things like flooding here in the state of Kentucky. That is one of our greatest projections for climate change in our state. You don't have to call it climate change, but we do need to be resilient to the flooding that happens every year. Building supportive networks, again, friends who get it, I think is a really important way to remain hopeful in this situation. Going back to the climate change fellows through EE capacity, these are folks that I rely on. They have information and tools. They listen. They celebrate successes. Find people in your network that you're not competing for resources. You're not competing for recognition. You're supporting each other and you're building each other up. I really think that's the only way that any of us in this field can get through in a way where we do remain hopeful and go to bed with one glimmer of hope every night. Take care of yourself. My greatest way to do that is to go on Pandora, type in the words protest songs, and it gets me through my day at my desk every day at work. Protest music, it's a great way to stay hopeful. Last slide, please. So I want to thank you all, and I just want to read this quote, and I feel like this is something that we've been doing in Kentucky slowly but surely. The secret to change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but building the new. And I truly believe that that's what we're doing. And I think slowly but surely it is working, even in a state like Kentucky, which is beautiful and wonderful, but we've got a ways to go. Thank you to Judy, thank you, Vicki, and thank you to the other panelists for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jenny. Great job. So I know we are running a little bit behind and don't have a lot of time for questions. I know some of us tried to answer some of them virtually, but I'd love to do a lightning round based on a couple of questions that seem to have a common theme, and just ask all the panelists to maybe answer in, your quick 30-second elevator pitch, because we've been asked by a couple of people questions related to how do you deal when you're educating about climate change with those who are either overwhelmed by this information and shut down, or who might even be defensive or defiant. And I think I'd like to start with Billy, since you probably deal with the most, general public kind of folks coming through the aquarium as you try to educate people. What do you do in those situations?
Yeah, I think we definitely are not trying to alarm people and freak people out. We're really trying to help people see their way to what they can join together to do. And we really, one of the things we found is that through training interpreters, the interpreters themselves leave with a sense of confidence and hope and self-efficacy. And it's kind of contagious. And that's the thing that we found, is that in addition to the science message and kind of the fact-based conversation, the tone of the conversations that educators are having is really positive and hopeful, because that's what they believe based on their experience. So I think that's really kind of an essential element And often what people are overwhelmed by is they just don't know what to do. And we try to give people really practical steps to take in terms of not just specific actions, but what kind of organizations are you already a part of? What's happening in your town? What's happening in your church? What's happening in your workplace? How can you connect with those things? Because dealing with an issue like this, as Jennifer said really well, and Bernard also referred to, we really need social and emotional support. And that's a really critical part of this.
So I see Bernard nodding his head. Anything to add there, Bernard?
I would just add finding out what a person's values are, because then you can make those connections with shared values. There are many different aspects of climate change that people connect with, and so being able to help a person find out that they have a connection that they didn't realize is really eye-opening. And then also just refraining from getting too technical unless you're dealing with a person who loves the technical parts. You know, there's just a way to simplify the information. Billy talked about a blanket, just ways of communicating in ways that people can connect and they feel like they're invited in, and you can continue to build from there.
Great. And Jenny, in Kentucky, I assume sometimes you might encounter folks who are defensive, given that there's been this rhetoric about the war on coal when the Obama administration tried to pass policies like the Clean Power Plan. What do you do in that setting?
Yeah, so I, you know, that's kind of the story of my life. I think, again, it's really, you know, knowing your audience as much as possible ahead of time and knowing what to expect. Again, if I were in Vermont, if I were in California, it may be a little more shocking to me to experience that. But because I've kind of gone through that every time I've done a climate talk or a workshop, I think, again, like Bernard just said, it's really knowing what's important to folks, not even sometimes calling it climate change, right? But finding ways to talk about things so that they see, you know, again, people here can identify with flooding. We don't have to call it climate change, but we can talk about some of those issues. Maybe we get deeper into it and then start talking about climate change, but not trying to go at people with all of the information at one time, because it just turns folks off.
So those are really helpful. And as you can see from my presentation, as a group that works with state and local communities, I try to focus, and I did this recently with a church group just this weekend, on some of the examples of what is possible and what is happening. And I find that gives people a sense of hope that even though right here in Washington, you know, there's been a lot of bad news at the federal level in terms of rollback, that there are states, including a lot of Western states, including a lot of Republican-led states, that are supporting the move to renewables. A lot of companies are doing that because they're becoming much more affordable. And so that gives people hope that we have the technological solutions to solve this issue, even as we are preparing for some of the impacts that are inevitable. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Judy. And first of all, please join me in thanking virtually the wonderful speakers on this panel, Billy, Bernard, and Jenny. And back to you, Judy.
Thank you so much, Vicki, and to all the panelists. What a great discussion. Really appreciate all of you preparing that in a way that packages it with great information, but also your personal stories in there, including Vicki, that your families lost their homes during Katrina, and Bernard, your personal story. And Billy, I'm sure you've got a million stories. And Jenny, you've really had a mix of great perspectives and given us great hope for what we all can do in a really difficult time in the world's history. So in closing here, I just wanted to mention one other thing. We will continue the conversation, but you also can find a lot on EE Pro. And one project that we're not going to have time to talk about is part of our EE Works, of looking at really what does the research say about what works in environmental education. And Cy, the next slide, Martha Monroe from the University of Florida did a systematic review on what aspects of climate change programs are working, looking at over 1,000 abstracts, selecting 49 papers to look for common themes. And next slide, Cy. So some of the big ideas are going to be posted on our website, like good climate education is just good education, project-based work. talking about engaging learners and what they know, why they know it, how they know it. And the next slide, please. And there are examples that she and her team found on if you're looking for good climate change education, what you should keep in mind. Keep going. Next slide. And then all of this will be on EE Pro under the climate change discussion group, and all the resources that Vicki listed. And her website has so many great things that I think some educators don't realize that the Georgetown Climate Center is there and has done a lot of homework in terms of you being able to find what you need to look at. And then Bernard gave his information. Billy and the whole Noki project has been just fantastic. And Jenny has a ton of experience about how to work in areas where there is pushback, and many of you do too. So keep the discussion going on EE Pro. Thank you all again. And tomorrow the session is at noon, Growing and Supporting the Movement. We have a panel of funders, and I think we're going to have our panelists from Puerto Rico joining. It has been hard to communicate with our panelists, but we're really excited about that. And then tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we have our last live stream and our last session of Virtual Week with 4 of our amazing EE 30 under 30 young leaders with our facilitator, Danny Washington, and that'll be live streamed at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. So thank you all so much for joining. This will be recorded and posted on EE Pro, and we appreciate you all joining, and all the panelists. And Vicki, thank you so much for moderating. Take care, everyone. Great job.
Bye.